Are Galactus, Alioth, and He Who Remains actually connected in a way that we didn't initially realize? The Fantastic Four leaked trailer, which premiered at Comic-Con, gave us our first glimpse into the MCU debut of Galactus, the Devourer of Worlds. This is one of Marvel's most iconic and well-known villains, not to mention one of the most powerful, and Galactus' arrival in comic-accurate form is going to be a treat to behold in theaters. Perhaps best well known for his insatiable hunger and his propensity to eat entire worlds, Galactus cannot be reasoned or bargained with, only warded off or defeated if a planet is to survive an encounter with the Devourer. But today, we wanted to explore something that is a current rumor courtesy of the Cosmic Circus, that Galactus will have no multiversal variants. If this is to be believed, then this would mean that just like America Chavez, Galactus has no equal on any timeline within the multiverse, and we believe that this is a key piece of information that could actually help us identify the origin and intentions of Galactus. The reason why America Chavez does not have any variants in the MCU is because she comes from a realm known as the Utopian Parallel, which exists outside of the main multiverse, and does not originate from any timeline of Earth. We know that the temporal loom weaves time into an infinite number of different realities, but there are some domains who exist outside of this reach. In the comics, this is where the Beyonders come from, and in the MCU, this is where the TVA has built its headquarters, and of course, the Utopian Parallel as well. So then, if this is true, then this would suggest that Galactus may have actually been a multiversal entity rather than a universal threat. We will be getting into Fantastic Four 2 and the arrival of Galactus a little bit later in the video, but let's break down the comics. If we break down Galactus' comic origins and compare them to this idea, this interpretation actually does make sense. In the comics, Galactus was originally born as Galen of Tay, and he was a relatively normal individual, but what's important about Galactus' origin is that he's actually a survivor from the previous universe. In the comics, ages of the universe are known as Cosmos, and the 7th Cosmos ended with the Secret Wars arc, which saw the destruction of the multiverse and its eventual reconstruction into its 8th Cosmos. In essence, heroes were living in an age of the 7th Cosmos, otherwise known as the 7th Age of the Universe, which ended when the wave of incursions wiped out everything except for the survivors of Battleworld which Doom had constructed. Eventually, this was reborn, and heroes now were living in the 8th Cosmos. Galactus, however, comes from the 6th Cosmos, and is quite literally a holdover from the last age of the universe. If we are to adapt this into what we know of the MCU, then the 6th Cosmos would be the eon where He Who Remains won the multiversal war, and then reconstructed the timeline into one sacred timeline rather than a more lively multiverse. Why this is important, as this means that Galactus was around when He Who Remains won that war, and at first was at war with his other variants, and somehow Galactus carried over. He Who Remains would have ended the 6th Cosmos and started the 7th, but we know that he was not alone. With him, he brought Alioth, the ultimate weapon, the interdimensional guard dog that he used to consume entire realities on a whim, which we know exists in the 6th Cosmos and is another holdover from the previous universe. After Alioth was weaponized, he was able to eradicate the multiverse as a concept and eliminate every possible variant of himself that could ever exist. But with that said, who is to say that He Who Remains first and only weapon was Alioth? What if there were more weapons? After all, Galactus had to have survived somehow, and we find it incredibly hard to believe that he could have made it out of the 6th Cosmos alive without He Who Remains knowing about it, which leaves us to wonder if He Who Remains willingly allowed Galactus to survive. If this is the case, then this would imply that Galactus did something for He Who Remains in order to earn his survival, and we believe that we figured out what he did. We know that He Who Remains set out with an objective in mind, which was to find a way to consume entire worlds. So is it possible that before he found Alioth, he first attempted to bargain with Galactus? We know that the comic version of Galactus is not focused on destroying universes. Galactus simply drifts from planet to planet in order to consume their energy for sustenance. Galactus bears no ill will or malice towards the planet that he eats. He just regards them as a meal, and does not concern himself with the lives on the various worlds. Galactus needs life energy in order to survive and sustain himself, but he doesn't usually drift between realities and timelines, so this does actually make some sense. He Who Remains may have sent Galactus around to different realities in order to specifically destroy the Earths within them, rather than sacrificing the entire timeline if he thought he didn't have to. This is important because if you remember, Kang variants are humans born on Earth, but He Who Remains destroyed entire timelines with thousands of other planets in the universe, not just Earths. He wiped out countless variants of Xandar, Skrullos, Asgard, Titan, Sakaar, just to make sure none of his variants were ever born or escaped. This seems to be a nuclear option that He Who Remains only arrived at out of desperation, because logically, it would seem that by eliminating Earth, he could stop variants of himself from being born, and thus allow the multiverse to thrive without the intervention of Kangs. Why would he immediately jump to destroying entire realities and timelines if this is true? Well, we believe that he didn't start with Alioth. We believe that He Who Remains started small with Galactus. Galactus may have been his first weapon and his first plan. Perhaps He Who Remains believed that by eliminating Earths from the timeline, then this would be an adequate solution, but it was too small scale and something went wrong. Galactus was already eating entire worlds, so why not put him to work targeting him at the right worlds for He Who Remains' agenda and to stop the Kangs? For a while, this solution may have appeared to be promising, but we know that it could not last. Whether Galactus couldn't work fast enough, whether he deviated from his objective, and was too dangerous, or even Kangs being born on other planets besides Earth, we do not know, but what we seem to know is that Galactus did survive this multiversal war. This would explain how Galactus is simultaneously a planet-level threat as well as a multiversal entity without any variants, simply because he is not from this cosmos just like America Chavez is not. From here, he and He Who Remains worked at their task, but the Kangs just kept coming, and we believe that He Who Remains got more and more desperate. Since we know that Galactus does not consume entire universes, he dismissed Galactus of his service, and let the Devourer of Worlds continue to drift across the multiverse and choose which worlds he wanted to consume. He Who Remains then set out to find something that could eradicate timelines, and this is when he found and weaponized Alioth, the second phase of his plan. When the multiverse ended though, then Galactus would have gone somewhere to survive, whether this was on the sacred timeline or somewhere outside of the timeline. It makes sense that He Who Remains would let this first ally live in peace as a thanks for his help. And now that Alioth has taken up the mantle of the Citadel Guardian, he no longer needed Galactus. Even if he didn't need him, he also wasn't going to just let him die as the multiverse collapsed in on itself. The fact that if this rumor is true, and if there is only one Galactus, indicates that he was allowed to live somewhere within the void outside of the main reality, drifting while He Who Remains managed the new sacred timeline. If there aren't any variants, we don't believe Galactus actually lived on the sacred timeline, because if this was the case, then variants of himself would have multiplied after He Who Remains was killed. But luckily, we have a pretty good idea of where and how Galactus survived. We know that the Citadel of He Who Remains and the Council of Kangs have both external views on the multiverse, locations where they are allowed to see individual timelines, so there is space out there for Galactus to live, even if it's in a dormant state. While there are likely plenty of worlds for Galactus to feed on out there, he could eat and not interfere with He Who Remains' new plan. We know that Galactus has to consume life force in order to live, but luckily for us, there is an adequate supply of different life energy that Galactus can feast on. Every time a timeline deviates and creates a branching reality, it creates a new set of planets within the universe that are all destined to eventually die out. These same variants of all of these planets we lifted before exist on this new timeline, even if it's only for a bit before the timeline is pruned. If a timeline branches, then Galactus would go down to this timeline and would be able to feast on a planet and get back out before the TVA pruned the branch and set the timeline back to its original place. He is quite literally growing his own food by waiting for a timeline to splinter so that Galactus can feast on a planet that's just going to die anyway before the TVA steps in. Now that He Who Remains is dead though, the multiverse is now alive and thriving. But somewhere outside, Galactus may have been waiting and watching. He could have been witness to the reconstruction of the 7th cosmos, and now he has a buffet of timelines to choose from. Galactus could have floated towards the multiverse like a cartoon character smelling a pie, and chosen a reality to call home. There would have to be some wiggling around with Fantastic Four 2 and that variant of Galactus, but because he was just a giant cloud essentially, I do believe that they can make it work if the rumor is true. This would be how Galactus has arrived at the timeline that we've been calling Earth 4, which is where the Fantastic Four is set to take place, and thus, how Galactus will now be included in that project going forward as a multiversal level threat. But anyway friends, what do you think of this rumor and our theory for how this could fit in? Did He Who Remains weaponize Galactus before Alioth? And do you think Galactus was He Who Remains' first weapon, And is this why he was allowed to survive? As always, my friends, please leave your thoughts below on this theory. What do you think of Galactus entering the MCU and the Fantastic Four? Hulk smash that subscribe button for daily Marvel content, and have a phenomenal one.